Athens, 4th century BCE. In the middle of a crowded court, a woman named Phryne stood on trial. She wasn't just any woman. Phryne was one of the most famous courtesans in Athens, known for her beauty and her influence over powerful men. But that day, her life hung by a thread. The charge, impiety against the gods, a crime punishable by death. The court was ready to condemn her. In Athens, accusations of impiety were no small matter. They had sent even great thinkers like Socrates to his death. For a woman, especially one with Phryne's reputation, the outcome seemed certain. But then came the twist that made history. Her defender, the orator Hyperiades, suddenly tore open her robe, exposing her body before the jury. The judges gasped, stunned into silence. In Athens, beauty was seen as a sign of divine favor, and the sight of her naked form was enough to sway them. They acquitted her. Phryne walked free, not because of evidence, not because of justice, but because her body had been turned into her only defense. This shocking moment became one of the most talked about trials of ancient Athens. But while Phryne escaped with her life, she was a rare exception. She was a courtesan, connected to powerful men, and she had the luck of being defended in court. For enslaved women, things were brutally different. They had no trials, no lawyers, and no chance to sway judges with beauty or words. Their punishments were harsher, public, and often hidden from the historical record. The same city that spared Phryne because of her body also perfected the use of torture, branding, and death against women who were enslaved. And it's in those hidden stories, of women who could not defend themselves, that the darkest side of Athenian justice is revealed. In Athenian society, enslaved women weren't considered people at all. They were property, owned by a master who could sell them, rent them, or punish them without restraint, unlike men who had rights as citizens. Enslaved women had no legal protection. They couldn't testify in court unless tortured, couldn't marry legally, and couldn't own anything, not even their own children. Most of them were foreigners, captured during wars or bought in bustling slave markets like the Agora of Athens. A war in Thrace or Asia Minor could suddenly flood Athens with hundreds of women, chained and sold to the highest bidder. And what awaited them? Their lives fell into three main paths: brothel slaves. The most brutal fate was reserved for those sold into prostitution. Athens was filled with brothels, many owned by the state itself. Women here were stripped of all dignity, forced to serve countless men daily, with punishment waiting if they resisted. The chilling part? Athenian democracy prided itself on freedom, yet that freedom only applied to male citizens. Behind the polished image of philosophers and statesmen, enslaved women carried the hidden burden of Athens' greatness. Their punishments were not only about discipline but also about fear and control. A master had the legal right to inflict pain at will, because the law didn't recognize enslaved women as victims. When punishment struck enslaved women in Athens, it was swift, brutal, and designed to remind everyone of their place. Unlike citizens, who had courts and laws, enslaved women faced direct violence from their masters, violence that was often sanctioned by the state itself. Public whipping at the Agora. The marketplace of Athens, the Agora, wasn't just a place for trade and politics. It was also a stage for punishment. Enslaved women accused of theft, disobedience, or even talking back could be stripped and whipped publicly in front of crowds. Athenian orators like Demosthenes mentioned slaves being beaten openly to teach lessons, not only to them but to anyone watching. For enslaved women, this meant humiliation as much as pain. Their punishment turned into a spectacle. Branding with hot iron. Escape was one of the greatest fears of slave owners. To prevent it, Athens relied on one of the cruelest methods: branding. Runaway enslaved women were often caught and burned with hot irons, marked forever with a scar on their forehead. The playwright Aristophanes even joked about slaves with brands in his comedies, proof that this practice was not rare, but common enough to be mocked on stage. Imagine, the same audience that laughed at such jokes would have seen real women scarred for life. Sexual punishments in brothels. Some enslaved women suffered punishments that blurred the line between discipline and abuse. Athens was filled with brothels, many state-owned, where women were forced to serve endlessly. If they resisted, refused clients, or tried to run, they faced savage beatings, chaining, or starvation. Orators like Hyperides and Athenian legal records mention enslaved prostitutes treated worse than livestock. In these places, punishment was not only about control, it was about breaking their will entirely. Testimony under torture. In Athenian courts, the testimony of enslaved people, including women, was considered useless unless extracted through torture. This was legal practice. They were stretched on the rack, whipped, or burned until they confessed what their masters wanted them to say. Think about the cruelty. In a city that invented democracy and trial by jury, the word of an enslaved woman only mattered if she screamed it under agony. Death by beating or exposure. For the gravest offenses, murdering an infant, resisting masters, or repeated escape attempts, the punishments turned fatal. Some enslaved women were beaten to death, their bodies discarded without burial rites. Others were taken outside the city walls and abandoned to die of exposure, a silent execution meant to erase them. Legal speeches hint at these practices, but because enslaved women left no written voices, their deaths often vanished into silence. Athens celebrated itself as the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, and freedom. But beneath that shining surface was a system that normalized torture, sexual exploitation, and death for enslaved women. Their punishments weren't mistakes, they were part of the machinery that kept the city running. But if these punishments were so common, then why don't we read about them in every history book on Athens? The truth is chilling, Athenian society chose to hide them. Athens was obsessed with its public image. To the outside world, it wanted to be remembered as the birthplace of democracy, the land of Socrates, Plato, and Pericles. Writers and orators celebrated freedom, philosophy, and civic debate, but only for male citizens. The voices of enslaved women were erased, because acknowledging their suffering would stain Athens' shining reputation. When punishments were mentioned, they were usually in jokes or passing remarks. Playwrights like Aristophanes mocked branded slaves on stage, turning scars into comedy. Orators like Demosthenes and Lysias spoke of torture as if it were normal courtroom procedure, not cruelty. For them, these punishments weren't injustices, they were just everyday tools of control. And so, the brutality remained in the shadows. Enslaved women rarely left written records. Their stories only survive in fragments, in speeches, in passing references, in archaeological evidence of brothels and slave quarters. Historians of the time weren't interested in their suffering, because enslaved women didn't matter to Athens' democracy. This selective memory explains why Athens is remembered as a beacon of liberty while its dark system of enslavement is almost forgotten. The punishments of enslaved women weren't accidents, they were deliberately silenced, hidden behind the glory of philosophy and politics. And that silence makes the reality even more brutal. For every famous speech in the Athenian assembly, countless women were whipped.
Or broken in the shadows, unrecorded, unnamed, and erased.